And we're back today for an interview with Timothy Brennan, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota in Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature. Good morning, Tim. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Very well, thanks. So just to give a quick intro about you, you are, as I said, a professor at the University of Minnesota. Your essays and course offerings deal with issues of intellectual history, cultural theory, the Marxist and phenomenological traditions, the avant-gardes, theories of colonialism and imperialism, problems of translation, and popular music. You're the author of numerous books, including books on popular music. But the book that we're really going to talk about today is your recent biography of Edward Said called Places of Mind, which was published last year. And the reason we're speaking today is because I recently read and reviewed the book Orientalism by Edward Said, which was published in 1978. And so it's fascinating and so interesting to get the opportunity to speak to you about Edward Said, about the book Orientalism and his biography. So let's start with the first and most obvious question, which is tell us a little bit about the path that led you from being a student of Edward Said, I presume at Columbia University, to deciding to research Edward Said's life and work and writing this biography, Places of Mind.
Okay, well, thank you. It's really nice to be here. Although some might expect that I was knocking on the doors of publishers to tell this story I had, it didn't happen that way. I was involved in a completely different project and got a call out of the blue from Andrew Wiley, who's a high-powered literary agent, who I happen to know about because, I'd written a book on Salman Rushdie, and he was Rushdie's, agent. But so he calls me out of the blue and says that there's a lot of interest in New York for an intellectual biography of Edward Said among commercial publishers, and he had heard that I was the one to write it. So I thought, wow, this doesn't happen every day. It does mean I'm going to have to drop what I'm doing, which isn't good. But on the other hand, this will be a different kind of book for me, and will give me an agent in New York, forever, and will make me write for a different kind of audience. So after sitting on it for about 3 or 4 days, I decided to take the plunge, really not knowing whether I could pull off an intellectual biography, certainly not a commercially viable one, right? Mm-hmm. I had written long monographs on individual people before, so I had kind of a biographical bent in some of my writing before that, but nothing on this scale. The other thing is that I really felt committed to the topic. I mean, I really felt like I understood Said, who was a controversial figure. People, are usually interested in one element of his complex personality and intellectual life of achievement, and not the others, right? So some people will know him as a music scholar, some people as a Palestinian activist, some people as a literary critic, but not all those things combined. And I really felt that given my own interests and background, I did in fact have a foot, as it were, in all of these different parts of his personality. But more than that, I just think he's one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th century. And it was purely good fortune that I got to know this guy. So I am dedicated, right, to telling his story in a fair way that touches on all these. So I felt like, as inconvenient in some ways as it is to write this book, and as uncertain as the outcome, I felt I just had to do it, as a matter of commitment to his legacy. So that's kind of how it came about. But it was a very personal relationship, even when I was a student with him, and then it continued. After I got my degree, I happened to be a professor in New York, so I was there to teach his classes when he was out of town, or to meet for scotch or lunch or so on. So I knew him. The other thing, I had written about him. I mean, I'd written maybe 13 essays on him by the time I was asked. So I had sort of a head start, as it were, in the writing of the book. I knew some of what I wanted to say. But of course, I learned all kinds of things that I never would have thought about.
You were really the ideal person to write this book in terms of having a personal relationship with Edward Said, but also being able to connect all these different facets that you were talking about in terms of that people generally focus on one facet over another. You were able to bring all of those together, as it were.
Yeah, I think that the people who were behind my being chosen to write this biography were members of the family who were familiar with how I had talked about Edward in public and what I had written about Edward before that. That's part of it. But I think it's also that they made a very conscious decision that the people to approach to write a biography of Edward have got to be people who really understood his intellectual commitments, right? People who know the body of literary and linguistic theories and philosophies and so on, because it is such a huge part of what made him who he was, but also what made him successful. This is my argument, is that it isn't just that he was a professor on the side. It was that he learned how being a humanist and intellectual within the university, somebody who reads everything and is curious about what he does not know, this kind of general intellectual, carries with it a certain kind of nonpartisan authority, right? So he's really kind of this image of the intellectual that we would associate, let's say, in France with Jean-Paul Sartre, or in Germany with Jürgen Habermas. I mean, that kind of figure. The United States is a very unpropitious place to be that kind of intellectual, and yet he.
I mean, it's more politicized. Do you mean in the United States?
It's a more anti-intellectual culture. So the people who are the big public intellectuals in our society are media pundits, right? Or people who are part of right-wing foundations in Washington. They're not general intellectuals, certainly not literary intellectuals like he was. So he really pulled something off that I think was almost unimaginable. It's very, very unusual that he was able to succeed in a period of sort of right-wing reaction, right? A kind of the conservative turn that took place after Reagan. This is when he came into his own. This is when Orientalism had just been published. He managed to be a media celebrity and an important person who was conferred with, by heads of state and by political organizations all around the world, writing in crossover journals and magazines at the same time that he's writing dense theoretical works for an academic audience. And he made all this kind of gel and come together, and they contributed. So it took somebody who, maybe not who studied with him necessarily, although that happened to be the case with me, but people who understood how his intellectual work bore on his political advocacy and his media celebrity.
Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about the success of Orientalism, and in parallel, we can talk about the origin of the project, as you just described. It came from quite a commercial source. Andrew Wiley is considered to be a bit of a super agent, very commercial individual in the business. And yet, in my review of Orientalism, I thought one of the things that really leapt up at me, that surprised me, was how impactful and influential this book had been, despite a very dense academic prose. I mean, this is not vernacular for the everyman out there, and yet it seems this book reached a very wide audience. And now it seems you're telling me your book was commissioned with an idea to reach a very wide audience. So how is this where's this bridge of academia and commercial success? What's the secret of Orientalism, and how does that translate to your book having this commercial appeal?
Well, it is a bit astounding, isn't it, that Orientalism, anybody who sat down and actually read it, and I mean read all of it, would kind of scratch their heads and say,
Guilty as charged, and I honestly thought, how did this sell millions of copies?
Because it gets into the minutiae of novelists from France and England from the 19th century, and it's really kind of its stars, as it were, right? The protagonists of the story are
densely referenced,
are these literary and linguistic scholars, philologists, they're called, right? From, again, the 19th, mostly the 19th, but also the 20th centuries in France and England. And some of the kind of the polymathic activities that they're involved in, the study of dead languages. All these sorts of issues you would not think would be very sexy. But see, here's the thing. On the one hand, there has been a long tradition in the Arab world of intellectuals who were, trying to pinpoint the prejudices that arose from the caricatures that had been created about Arabs and Muslims in the West, right? So that dimension of the book, which is one that I suppose a lot of people will think is the beginning and the end of his argument. It's just about caricatures, misrepresentations of the Oriental in. And of course, Oriental, in his book doesn't mean the Far East. It's not China and India.
Very much focused on that region.
He's using the term as it was, in fact, commonly used, throughout the late 19th and early 20th century to refer to the Middle East. So he's talking about Arabs and Muslims. Yeah. So, and I'm not trying to say that the book is not about that, but it's just that what made the book take off, I think, is all the other things it was at the same time about. So on the one hand, he is making this argument about the caricatures. On the other hand, he's trying to say, wait a minute, literary scholars, as obscure as they seem, actually affect public policy. They're able to create an agenda that allows certain prejudices already in circulation to solidify and are given a certain kind of scholarly authority, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that whole element, right? That literary scholars, even the ones involved in arcane subjects, actually are setting the agenda in a lot of different ways, in ways that are completely surprising, right? Next, there's the whole kind of roman à clef aspect of the book, which is that it's ostensibly and actually about these people who are complicit in the culture of empire, who think of themselves in high-minded ways as being sort of lovers of Islamic and Arab culture, right? But who are nevertheless kind of involved willy-nilly in kind of a very deleterious and violent imperial policy, right? So the thing is, though, that it isn't only about, reading between the lines, and it really, if you read the whole book, it's not just between the lines, because he says it kind of more or less openly towards the end, is this whole idea that what he's really talking about are these contemporary figures who have kind of sold out as kind of inside witnesses of the perfidy of the Islamic mind, right? So people, these psychoanalytic almost accounts by certain scholars, right? One of them, he wrote the book at a Harvard Institute with one of these guys that he's actually addressing in the book. The guy's name is Yehoshaphat Harkabi, who used to work for, the IDF, right, which is the Israeli army, doing all kinds of perfidious things, but who then later, kind of in a liberal sentiment, was writing about the Arab mind and how they think about us and all the rest of it. So these documents are actually employed by like the CIA or by institutes that help governments form policies, and so he's able to show that direct connection, right? So what I'm getting at, and I could go on and on, but there's like 4 or 5 different levels. It's like reading Dante, where things are happening here at the allegorical level and happening at the political level. So it's this concert, this symphonic sort of arrangement that's involved there that I think is working on a number of different audiences at the same time, right? On the one hand, he's talking to the non-white scholars who have not found a place yet in the Western Academy and who come from wealthy middle-class families. They're well-established in their own countries, but are coming over to the United States or Britain to study, and he's talking to them, and he's opening up doors for them, and he's making it possible for a demographic change, of huge significance in the academy. On the one hand, it's that. On the other hand, he's talking to the American public about the so-called pundits, experts, that we see every night on the nightly news, and making us think twice about the story that they're telling us. And then finally, I'll end here, that he's talking about the importance, the centrality of the humanities when it comes to the political current events of our day. I mean, he's the literary scholar becomes a kind of hero of the work. Yeah,
a central figure in the setting of policy. So one of the layers in the book that is more visible and less subtle, let's say, is the shift from, let's say, the 19th century Orientalism, guided mostly by British and French thinkers, intellectuals, and so on, to a 20th century that is led more, let's say, by American thinkers. Take us a little bit through that shift. How did that affect views, Orientalist views, setting of policy, and so on?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, in the background here, he's thinking, this is written in the 1970s, Okay, so it's very much partaking of, I mean, for those who don't remember the 70s, who aren't old enough to remember it, firsthand, it was a very political age. I mean, this is the age when a lot of the third world works of the classics, like by Frantz Fanon and so on, or the political Marxist work of Antonio Gramsci, are being translated for the first time, coming into the American lexicon. This is a time when women's and black studies programs are being created for the first time. It's a very radical era. And he's trying to say, in part, that the Palestine issue is one of the Palestinian people are involved in one of the most heroic and significant anti-colonial liberation movements of the 20th century, and there's all this political activity around the Vietnam War, which of course he totally supports. But he's saying, why are there not flag burnings or marches on the Capitol when it comes to the Palestinian struggle, right? It's very consequential. Obviously, too, Imperial Britain kind of handed the baton off to Imperial United States in the making Israel viable as a kind of, from their point of view, a kind of colonial settler state plopped right down into an alien culture that then becomes a client state. It becomes a kind of a point of departure, stepping off point for Americans' designs on the entire region, on oil and the kind of geopolitical centrality of this crossroads of civilizations that the Middle East has always been. I mean, all of those sorts of things. So this movement that you described from Europe to the United States is very much with that idea in mind, that the United States is now the great, habilitator or whatever, the great supporter of Israel, and they're the ones that allow Israel, protect Israel from the public rebuke that they have received internationally. So this is partly what he's trying to say. But, partly in answer to your question, I think I would also maybe refer to the question before this a little bit and say that one of the things that made it a very popular book is that it's demonstrably angry, right? That it's both scholarly and it's angry. So there's this emotive side of things, almost a polemical edge to it, that allowed him, forced him, I would say, in some ways, to kind of bend the stick a little bit too much and say things a little too extreme. Like he implies at some points almost like if anybody is a European or a white American, they can't possibly solidarize with or understand, our plight. And I don't think so much else he's done in his career led in a different direction. He would not have endorse that idea. But there's moments in this polemical dimension of Orientalism where he appears to be saying that kind of thing. So, but I think that it became important because it was saying these things that I'm talking about in the book that are from an earlier era show us the institutional and organizational edifice that in a direct line, directly continuous, this isn't just an analogy, directly continuous is what has produced this culture of the experts who are telling us always about the terrorist mentality of Islam, on the nightly news, right? There's a connection there.
Tracing that genealogy back to the earliest Orientalists.
Right. So, I mean, the importance of anger in scholarship is something that he's communicating to an entire cadre, an entire sort of sector of the intelligentsia recently arrived from the former colonies or related to those who were by name or birth, who are entering the US and British academies. So he's leading a wave and he's teaching people how to put things and what combination of erudition and high-mindedness and simple kind of rabble-rousing, right? How those two things can fit together in an explosive way. And that just opens up so many doors. I mean, people just go nuts with that and attempt to write their own Orientalisms for the next 3 decades. Yeah.
Right. Let's fast forward back to your book, Places of Mind. I'm curious to know what surprises or challenges you faced or you discovered while you were writing it. Was there anything that caused you to rethink your views on Edward Said and his work, or that shifted your point of view on that?
Yeah, I mean, in lots of ways. I mean, it's you'd expect that to happen, but it did happen. It really did. I mean, I felt like I really knew his work well. But when you start talking to 150 people who knew him in various phases in his life, obviously there's going to be things that you learn, but it also it's that whole picture as it fits together is going to be quite different. I guess I felt after doing the research that he was, first of all, much more politically committed and much more involved in politics before 1967 than everybody had thought beforehand. There's all kinds of evidence that he's a partisan of the Palestinian cause as a teenager. And that he's talking to people about it. It isn't just that he wrote something in his diary. I mean, he's kind of involved in it. He's writing articles for the Princeton newspaper. As a college kid, on the Suez crisis, and in ways that are very, very sophisticated and sort of like look forward to his later writing. So I could go on and on about it. So that's one thing that's very unusual. Number two, the degree to which he was involved in psychoanalysis. I mean, he was, of course, personally involved in analysis. He would see a therapist about twice a week. So there's that aspect of things. But I mean, I think that, and it's not really a dimension of him that I kind of took to or was particularly interested in when I was studying with him or reading about him. But I later learned that he really has woven much more fully into his work a kind of interest in Freud as a figure and a kind of socially committed psychoanalysis. So not like, the talking cure, the curing of neuroses, not that dimension, but the way in which people have psychologized political movements, and the way in which the Arab world in particular has suffered from not really developing a theory of mind that allows the critic to account for things like perversity, right? Or contradiction, right? Or cathexis. I mean, these kinds of ways in which things are not so on the surface, and so he's really constantly militating for a greater attention to psychoanalytic ideas in the Arab world, which he thinks is a big lack and has held it back. So there's that.
Sorry, a sort of psychoanalytic method, or what do you mean specifically?
It's social. I would say it's more a social psychology of the sort that one finds in Frantz Fanon, right? Right.
Okay.
In two senses. One, to kind of shunt to the side or to fend off those attempts to psychologize the Arab and the Islam by talking about the Arab mind, as with capital M. So there's that. But more than that, it's a self-critique. It's a self-interrogation of the intellectual discourse in the Arab world. And that's another dimension, by the way, that I learned more of. He's much more of an Arab intellectual than I knew. I did not know how he had so meticulously and assiduously apprenticed in the reading of the so-called Nada intellectuals, right? The intellectuals of the Arab Enlightenment of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century and carried on into the future. He closely studies them and learns from them. I learned a lot about his relationship to his it's a kind of a friend of the family, or he's distantly related. One of the great Arab statesmen from Lebanon, who was a right-wing Christian, anti-Muslim fellow, played a completely awful role from Said's point of view in the politics of the Middle East, but is an enormous intellectual in his own right, who studied with Heidegger in Germany and with Alfred North Whitehead in England. And this when Said comes over as like a 14-year-old, he has to have sponsors in the United States because his parents are still back in Egypt. So one of them is this guy, Charles Malik. And so what I discovered was a lot of the themes that Said developed in the course of his career came directly from Malik.
Wow.
That Malik was a huge influence on him. And I don't just mean, the idea that you could be a great intellectual and also a politician who, makes a difference, which Malik certainly did embody. I mean that the actual things that Malik was saying needed to be written about, the very themes of Said's later work, are spelled out by Malik. Now, of course, Said goes in a completely different direction, and he disavows Malik on the ground of his
But that was the intellectual starting point.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody's really discovered that before. So I mean, so there's lots of things like that. There's all things about his personal life too, about his involvement, with people romantically that I knew about in a vague sense, but really didn't have a full sense of. So that was there. But there were lots of things. So those are some of, I can mention more, but I think I've mentioned enough.
Sure, but so in terms of his background, I mean, he had a very eclectic background, very international, from Egypt to Palestine, and then arriving in the U.S. At a young age. Could anybody else have written a book like Orientalism? I mean, it seems like such a subject would require someone with those different points of views, with those different exposures to different cultures. Was he the ideal person to write that book? Could anybody else have written that?
I don't think so. And I think that that's true on a number of different levels. I mean, one of them is there's this particular combination in him, right? Of kind of a street fighting man, right? I mean, I think I note rather at the beginning of my book, that some of his friends would joke about this. On the one hand, they'd call him Eduardo, the dashing Renaissance intellectual, right? There's that dimension of him, right? And then they call him Abu Wadieh, which is like, the nom de guerre of a Palestinian revolutionary. And he really, I mean, for those who knew Edward personally, I mean, he was much, much more radical in the way that he talked off the record. So what I'm getting at is that, you have to have this kind of revolutionary commitment, right? That is a burning desire and drive to write the angry but also scholarly book that Orientalism is. I mean, not to mention all of these volumes of brilliant essays that he wrote for the Arab press that were later, anthologized and pulled together into volumes, which is that side of Edward that I really got to know in writing this book that I didn't really know as well. It's so creative and so wonderful and in so many genres and all the rest of it. So there's that dimension of him, right? But the charm of contraries that he also displayed. He has this kind of continental, hard to place American accent. It's not an American accent. It's not a British accent. It's not an accent that one associates with somebody from the Middle East. It's kind of Atlantic. It's cosmopolitan. It's his own thing. So there's that. And then he's always very well dressed, but kind of in an old-fashioned way. Kind of like an English gentleman, not like somebody who's into Italian design. Like what it wasn't au courant. It was more kind of a gesture to a certain kind of intellectual from the past, a kind of conservative, really, you would say. He dressed conservatively, I would say.
Which itself signals an opposite message to the more radical politics.
Which keeps people guessing. But, he's just, I know the word is overused, but, you say like, I mean, how many geniuses have I known in my life? Well, I really always felt the whole time I knew Edward that he was a genius, and a genius in a very particular way, that he had the uncanny ability to make the right decisions in his career at the right time. His timing was perfect, but he also really, really read people well. So I guess another way of putting that is that, and this has something to do with your question about the success of Orientalism, that he knew how far to go and what to avoid. He knew this far, but no farther.
It's revolutionary enough, but no further.
And there's some very kind of consciously worked temporizing and circumlocution, and I get into this a little bit in the book, that he kind of very syntactically clever at various points and dodging attributions, right? While nevertheless communicating what he wants to say for those with the ears to hear. So one of the things that I think I would say about him too, and this is related to the point I've just made, is that my favorite genre of all of the genres of Edward is the interview, because you get more of an idea of his personality and more of his unvarnished opinion, because he can't quite put a cap on it there, in quite the same way. Yeah, so I think that he's the only person who could have done it because of the body of knowledge that he had. He's the only person who could have done it because his close friends are revolutionaries. They're revolutionaries in arms who are the subject of death threats and almost got assassinated 3 or 4 times. These are the people he hangs out with, and who he always admired. In fact, I think he disparaged himself in relation to them, feeling like I don't have that ability to drop everything, to not care about privileges and prestige and accolades, right? He recognized that about himself, that this was a weakness on his part, right? That he couldn't become one of these revolutionaries, but he totally admired them and wanted to succeed in a different venue on their behalf, I guess. And so he played to those strengths. So there's that dimension, but this charm and worldliness and humor, and he's the kind of guy who knew everybody's name and the name of their partner. He never forgot, and he was so quick on the uptick. He just took over a room when he came in because he was so much fun to be around. And so that combination allowed him to be rewarded by academia and by the government even, right? Be rewarded while saying the things that he was saying. Which let's not forget, were completely beyond the pale when he first began. I mean, he changed the discourse over Israel. He made it professionally acceptable to be a critic of Israel.
So, final question for you, Tim, and thank you again so much for your time. With regard to your own work, after this biography of Edward Said, Places of Mind, what's next for you? Are you writing any upcoming books? What projects have you got lined up?
Well, the thing I dropped when
now that Andrew Wiley's your agent,
right.
what have you got?
Well, I mean, I like Edward have a commitment to the figure of the intellectual. I mean, I'm not trying to compare myself to him. He was who he was, but in my own way, I totally share that about him and prize it above all things. So I am still a professor, and I'm in the university, and I care a lot about that, and I'm involved a lot in that. And when I was asked to write this biography, I was in the midst of writing the second volume of a 2-volume work called Borrowed Light, which was all about the origins of anti-colonial thought in Europe. So I wrote the first volume, which is all about back in the 18th and 17th century and showing all these things, with European figures. And now in this next volume, it's all about the kind of revolutionaries of the interwar period from throughout the world who came to Europe to join the Third International. And it's all about how Europe is sort of hard to define. It's not this distant thing over there that somehow, allows people to be Eurocentric, which is equated with, being opposed to the aspirations and achievements of, the third world or something like that. It's much more mixed. It's much more of a joint creation. And so that's what I'm writing right now, just to kind of, complete what I had begun. But then I am going to, call on Andrew Wiley for the book after that, which is going to be more commercial, and it's all about blue blood radicals. So about aristocrats who were revolutionaries. So anyway, that's where I'm headed.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, Tim, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed speaking with you and learning more about Edward Said and the origins of the book Orientalism, and also learning more about your book Places of Mind, which was published last year, which I have confessed to you I've yet to read, but is definitely on my to be read list.
Well, please let me know what you think of it when you read it, and thank you again for allowing me to talk with you.
Will do, and thank you, Tim. Have a great day.
You too. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.